One of the stereotypes of video games is that games are primarily about violence. Unfortunately, that stereotype is mostly true. Game after game, we see conflict, violence, and war, usually on a massive scale. Why is that? What is it about gaming that seems to gravitate toward violence, almost to the point of excluding other types of narratives? I'll answer that after I beat these bandits.
Market forces.
That's right, we're going to talk about the industry first rather than the nature of games. Here on this channel, we tend to look at gaming narratives almost exclusively, but we really can't answer today's topic without looking at the player base of modern gaming. Gaming is huge right now, but the majority of gamers, in my view, are not the type that would play a long narrative-driven game. The market primarily is made up of people who prefer short-term bites of gameplay. And the publishers respond with games like Call of Duty, Dota, Overwatch, etc. Gorgeous games with lots of combat and short match times. Competitive gaming is the name of the game at the moment, and publishers have responded in kind. Now let's be sure not to be dismissive about this. I hear a lot of complaining about dude bros, casual gamers, etc. coming from people in the industry, but I think complaining about this misses the point. These games are the modern equivalent of playing tag, short, quick matches that demonstrate skill in games that are easily accessible to an otherwise non-gaming audience. For those of us who play games that have more depth, we should be learning what makes these games attractive to this huge base of gamers. This tendency towards violence in games is due to the fact that the majority of the market is in the competitive space. While one may lament the lack of diversity, it's easy to understand why publishers push games that are competitive and short in time commitment. That's what people want at the moment out of their gaming time.
Historical narratives.
Short on budget for a gaming narrative? Need context but aren't willing to create a new world with its own history? Just borrow some of real history. Easy peasy. A lot of mainstream games involving conflict also tend to use real-life conflicts as the basis of their gameplay. If it's Call of Duty or Battlefield or even Rise, Son of Rome, lots of games tend to use historical conflicts as a foundation for their game. The benefits for doing this are obvious. The story is practically written for the developer. For example, Call of Duty's World War II games have an easily recognized antagonist, the Nazis. No one is going to have trouble killing Nazis in a game. And basing a game in World War II settings already has the background narrative in place because everyone knows the history of the conflict. Modern military shooters in particular use this to great effect. Utilizing current political issues allows the developer to move away from having to establish a world because they're using the real one. Not a lot of exposition is necessary because you got that exposition during history class. Not to mention that these games tend to take great pride in accurately depicting aspects like weaponry and uniforms.
Easy to contextualize.
The previous point about military shooters is one instance of a general notion about conflict. It's easy to contextualize conflict in games where the focus is on combat. The good guy is you, the bad guy is the dude you are shooting at or stabbing. The bad guy may or may not deserve it. This is all the more apparent when even heavily narrative-driven games tend to fall into good guy warrior versus bad guy warrior narratives. Assaults, defenses, and everything in between only need a basic narrative of the threat to the player to create the context for the player's actions. To take an example, as I was writing this script, I watched a Let's Play of Earth Defense Force. The plot, if that term provides too much dignity, is alien bugs that look like ants have invaded the Earth. You are a grunt in the EDF, and your task is to kill the bugs. All in all, it looks like a fun shooter, especially with friends. And the gameplay is simple enough that even a casual gamer can hop in, kill things, and leave without too much hassle and commitment. There is very little exposition that gets in the way of the actual gameplay. But it's easy enough to understand the context because it's so basic. Giant alien bugs killing people. Need I say more? No. No, I don't.
Tried and true gaming.
This last point is a bit more introspective, but I think it goes to the heart of why so many games center around large-scale violence. Since the beginning of games, the plot has centered around some form of conflict. From the earliest games of tank warfare to Pac-Man to modern games, conflict sits at the heart of a lot of context in gaming. For the reasons listed before, violence in games tends to clarify the context in a way other story types would have difficulty in doing in early games. Think about a game like Super Mario Bros., one of the most iconic games in history. Mario's objective is to fight his way through each level to rescue Princess Peach. The simple narrative contextualizes the action, and the gameplay itself is easy to understand. Additionally, the reason why violence is so prevalent in games is that it gives the player something to do in the game. Often the combat is the main aspect of the gameplay. Even in heavily narrative-driven games, the combat is a core mechanic of that game. For example, the game Dragon Age Inquisition, and you know I'm going to talk about this game in a future video, the main story arcs are connected via combat objectives. After some narrative via cutscenes, a combat scene occurs where the player attempts to kill the enemy to advance the story. Thus, violence is the glue that connects one narrative point to the next. This is also true for a lot of side quests and narrative games. Side objectives that do not factor into the main story arc also employ violence as a means for the player to accomplish an objective, such as vanquishing bandits on the highway or killing zombies. And I think this is what most people mean when they say that games focus too much on violence. What they see is that for the vast majority of the time, gamers are engaged in simulated combat. and there are a few legitimate complaints about this trend. One of the big complaints is that violence is trivialized. Violence can be so pervasive that individual battles can lose significance. In other literature, violence is, though not exclusively, used sparingly. Violence in other literature is a means of resolution to a conflict, and as such is often at the climax, or at the very least present in very specific circumstances. Violence is so pervasive in games that the concept of conflict gets worked in when narratively it doesn't seem to belong. In BioShock Infinite, for instance, one of the criticisms that was leveled against it is that the game becomes a shootout very quickly in its narrative. The original BioShock took place in a city underwater that was collapsing due to violence brought on by insanity due to experimenting on humans. The player happens on that city and the combat is present because the player is trying to survive. In before the commenters point out there's more to the story. The point is that the narrative for BioShock naturally integrates the heavy emphasis on combat. Infinite, on the other hand, almost feels like the combat is forced into the narrative. Columbia, despite its many flaws, is an otherwise functioning society. When DeWitt, the main character, enters the city, situation gets bloody almost immediately. To be fair, from a narrative standpoint, if the police did catch him, DeWitt would probably be killed behind the scenes. But the notion that an entire city of cops just wants to off him feels out of place. A lot of the chaos that ensues is arguably unnecessary. Now, I know there's quite a bit of narrative that contextualizes all of the conflict, but it's hard to reconcile the opening where DeWitt is just strolling through the city versus the rest of the game where he's constantly in gun battle. Why is it that every time DeWitt rounds a corner in the park, the only people there are cops waiting to kill him? It just feels so inconsistent with the opening of the story. Some might differ with my feeling about Infinite, and that is fine. Suffice it to say, though, that violent conflict is so pervasive in games that violence itself is trivialized. It makes it harder for climactic battles to hold meaning when the player has been lopping off heads the whole game. So that's the long and the short of it, I think. Games have struggled for a long time to give experiences that are engaging that do not revolve around conflict. But given where the trends are, it's hard to fault developers for sticking to violence as the base for their games. Finally, it looks like there is hope on the horizon as we're seeing a resurgence of interest in other kinds of games. Games like Papers, Please, The Stanley Parable, and adventure games are making a comeback. Let's hope that these new trends are embraced by the modern gaming audience. That's all for now. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.